When my husband's sister moved into our home while I was pregnant, she did nothing to help. I cooked, cleaned, and managed everything, while she complained about my newborn crying at night, even suggesting that I move out with the baby so she could sleep. The shocking part? My husband agreed with her. When my husband first brought up the idea of his sister moving in, I hesitated. I was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and already anxious about preparing for the baby. Having another person in our small home felt overwhelming. But after he explained her situation, that she had lost her apartment and couldn't afford rent, I couldn't say no. She was family, after all. I convinced myself it would be temporary. At first, things seemed manageable. She arrived with just a few bags, mostly clothes and her laptop. She promised she'd stay only a couple of months, help around the house, and contribute when she could. I wanted to believe her, but the red flags appeared quickly. Within a week, her belongings had spread across the living room, turning it into her personal space. She claimed the guest room was too small for all her things. I bit my tongue and moved some of my baby items to make space. Most days, she'd sit on the couch, scrolling through her phone or binge-watching shows, while I handled dinner for everyone. One night, I mentioned it to my husband, saying it didn't seem like his sister was trying to improve her situation or look for work. He brushed it off, saying she just needed time to relax after everything she'd been through. I wanted to believe him, so I let it go. Weeks passed, then months, and nothing changed. She completely stopped pretending to job hunt. Whenever I tried discussing household contributions, she'd get defensive, claiming she was too stressed to think about work. Meanwhile, my pregnancy was far from easy. Swollen feet, back pain, endless checkups, yet I still managed the house. She, on the other hand, left dirty dishes in the sink and laundry piled in the bathroom. When I asked for help, she'd sigh and say she was too tired. The mess wasn't just physical, it was emotional too. She'd make passive-aggressive remarks like, "You're lucky your husband supports you," or, "I wish I could stay home all day like you." She acted as if pregnancy was a vacation, completely ignoring how hard I was working. I talked to my husband again, hoping he'd finally see how draining it was. He listened, but stayed neutral. "She has nowhere else to go," he said. "What do you want me to do? Throw her out?" His words hurt because that wasn't what I wanted. I just wanted respect and some effort from her side. I didn't push it. I told myself things would improve once the baby arrived. When our baby was born, my world felt brand new. Holding my little one for the first time made every struggle worth it. I thought maybe the joy of a new baby would soften my sister-in-law's attitude. I was wrong. During the first week home, the baby cried constantly, normal for a newborn. What wasn't normal was her banging on our bedroom door at 2 a.m., shouting that she couldn't sleep. "Can you keep that baby quiet? Some of us have work in the morning," she yelled, even though she didn't have a job. I was too exhausted to argue and focused on calming the baby instead. Her complaints didn't stop there. Every time the baby cried, she'd groan loudly or mutter about how inconsiderate we were. She even blamed the baby for not finding a job, saying she couldn't focus because of the noise. I tried to keep peace in the house, but it felt impossible. I was walking on eggshells, trying not to upset her while caring for my newborn. If I tried to talk about it, she'd play the victim. I told my husband we needed boundaries. I explained how her behavior was affecting me and the baby. He agreed in words, but never acted. He claimed he'd talk to her, but nothing ever changed. The breaking point came when she called a family meeting. She said she wanted to discuss how the baby's crying was affecting her mental health. She claimed she couldn't sleep, couldn't focus, and had no peace in the house. Then, she suggested that I and the baby move in with my parents for a few months, until things settle down. She said it like it was the most logical solution, as if I should leave my own home to make her comfortable. I looked at my husband, expecting him to step in and defend us, but he just hesitated. He said he understood her point of view and even suggested that her idea wasn't entirely unreasonable. My heart dropped. After everything I'd been through, carrying our child, giving birth, and holding our family together, his solution was to send me and the baby away so his sister could enjoy a quiet house. I felt disbelief, anger, and heartbreak all at once. That was the moment I knew something had to change. If I didn't stand up for myself and my baby, no one else would. That night, while I held my sleeping baby, I made a promise to myself. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about creating a safe, peaceful home for my child, free from the tension that had taken over our lives. If my sister-in-law couldn't respect that, she didn't belong under our roof. And if my husband couldn't see that, then he'd have to live with the outcome of his own choices. It was time to reclaim my home and my peace, no matter what it took. 4 days later, after that outrageous suggestion that the baby and I move out, I knew I couldn't let things slide. The tension in the house was suffocating, and my patience had completely run out. My husband acted as though nothing had happened, brushing off the conversation like it hadn't been a betrayal. Meanwhile, his sister strutted around like she'd won, barely acknowledging me or the baby. I stayed silent that night, not because I accepted what they said, but because I needed time to think. This time, I wasn't going to react from anger. I was going to make sure my voice was heard. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I sat down with my husband while the baby was napping. I told him we needed to talk. I explained that his sister's behavior had crossed every line, and that his support for her ridiculous idea had hurt me deeply. I reminded him this was our home, our family, and I deserved his support. He tried to minimize it, saying his sister wasn't thinking clearly and that I was being too harsh. He said I needed to be more understanding of her situation. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told him that I had already been more than understanding. I'd let her move in when I was 7 months pregnant, cooked for her, cleaned up after her, and tolerated her laziness for months. I'd ignored her passive-aggressive remarks, her complaints about the baby, and her complete disregard for me. But suggesting that I leave my own home? That was too far. He looked uneasy, but I kept going. I told him that if he couldn't stand up to her, then I would. I wasn't going to let anyone make me feel like a guest in my own house. And I definitely wasn't going to let anyone put my baby second. I could see guilt flash across his face, but before he could answer, the baby started crying. As I got up to comfort her, I told him we'd finish this conversation later, and that he needed to think carefully about where he stood. Later that afternoon, I decided it was time to talk to his sister directly. She was lounging on the couch, scrolling on her phone like she didn't have a care in the world. I stood in front of her, blocking the TV, and told her we needed to talk. She rolled her eyes and asked, "What now?" in the most dismissive tone possible. I stayed calm, though I could feel my anger bubbling. I told her that her behavior had been completely unacceptable, and her suggestion that I and the baby move out was not only insulting but absurd. She shrugged and said she was just trying to find a solution that worked for everyone. She claimed she needed her rest to get her life back together and couldn't do that with a crying baby around. I stared at her in disbelief. I asked if she even realized how selfish that sounded. I told her this was my home and my baby was my top priority. If she couldn't handle some noise, maybe she should find somewhere else to live. That clearly hit a nerve. She sat up, raising her voice, saying she had nowhere to go and that I was being unfair. She accused me of making her feel like a burden when she only wanted some peace. I didn't back down. I told her she was a burden because she refused to take responsibility for her life. I reminded her that she'd promised to stay temporarily, contribute to the household, and help out, but had done none of it. I told her I had been generous, but my kindness had limits, and she'd reached them. Her face turned red, but I didn't let her interrupt. I said that if she didn't like the noise, she was free to leave any time. Just then, my husband walked in, drawn by the raised voices. He looked between us, unsure what to do. His sister immediately started playing the victim, saying I was kicking her out when she had nowhere to go. I turned to him and said this wasn't about her having nowhere to stay. It was about her lack of respect for me, our home, and our baby. I told him that if he couldn't see that, then he was part of the problem. For the first time, I saw something change in his expression. He looked at his sister and told her she needed to apologize and start helping if she wanted to stay. She exploded, shouting that she didn't deserve to be treated like this, that she was family, and that family should support each other. I lost patience. I told her real family doesn't treat each other the way she treated me. Real family doesn't make a mother feel unwelcome in her own home or tell her to leave with her newborn. I said if she couldn't appreciate what I'd done for her, then she didn't deserve my patience anymore. I gave her 1 week to find another place to live. She stared at me, stunned. My husband tried to calm things down, saying we should talk it through, but I cut him off. I told him I'd done enough talking. This was final. If he wanted to keep enabling her, he could leave with her. The room went silent. For a second, I thought he might take her side, but he sighed and said he understood. He turned to his sister and told her to respect my decision. She stormed off, slamming her door. I stood there, shaking, a mix of anger and relief washing over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I had control over my own life again. That night, as I rocked the baby to sleep, I felt a calm I hadn't felt in so long. I knew the coming week wouldn't be easy, but I also knew I'd done the right thing. It was time to put my baby and myself first. 15 days later, the morning after our confrontation, the tension in the house was unbearable. My sister-in-law avoided me completely, hiding in her room and refusing to join us for meals. My husband, caught between us, stayed quiet, but I could see the guilt written all over him. I wasn't going to let him drift through this without facing it. I confronted him in the kitchen after breakfast while the baby was sleeping. I asked if he realized how much his silence had hurt me. I told him I felt abandoned, forced to handle everything on my own while he stood by. He stared into his coffee and said he didn't know what to do, that he felt stuck between me and his sister. He said she had always been the fragile one and that he felt responsible for her, especially after her life fell apart. I told him that while compassion was fine, it wasn't his job to let her walk over me to make himself feel like a good brother. I reminded him that I was his wife, the mother of his child, and that I deserved to feel safe and respected in my own home. I said if he couldn't prioritize us, then maybe he didn't deserve to be part of this family. That finally hit him. He looked up, his expression shifting. He said he didn't want to lose me or the baby, and that he'd try harder to support me. but he asked me to give his sister some time to process everything before she left. I agreed, reluctantly, but made it clear I wouldn't extend her stay beyond that week. Later, I overheard her in her room on the phone, venting to someone about how unfairly she was being treated. She claimed I was throwing her out with nowhere to go and complained about the baby crying all night, conveniently forgetting she was the one who told me to leave. I was furious, but decided not to respond. Instead, I focused on moving forward. Over the next few days, I began reclaiming my home. I boxed up her things neatly and placed them in the spare room, so there'd be no excuse for delay. My husband noticed, but wisely kept quiet. Her attitude only got worse. She left dishes everywhere, blasted the TV at night, and slammed doors whenever the baby cried. It was her way of retaliating, but I didn't let it bother me. Every petty act only confirmed I'd made the right choice. Finally, the week ended. That morning, I knocked on her door and told her it was time to go. She glared, but didn't argue. She packed her things in silence, shooting me dirty looks as she walked past. My husband helped her load the car, looking torn. But I didn't care. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about my child and me, and the peaceful life we both deserved. As she drove away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, a calm I hadn't felt in months. The burden I'd been carrying for months finally lifted. I turned to my husband and told him this was a fresh start for us, but only if he was ready to step up and prioritize our family. He nodded, saying he understood. He apologized for not supporting me sooner and promised to do better. I made it clear that I intended to hold him to that promise, because I would never again allow myself to be treated as an afterthought. That night, as I rocked my baby to sleep, I finally felt a peace that had been missing for far too long. The house was calm, and my baby was content. 10 days later, about a week after my sister-in-law moved out, the house truly began to feel like home again. The baby slept better, I slept better, and even my husband seemed to be making an effort to repair things. He was more attentive, more apologetic, though I could still sense his internal conflict about his sister. So when I heard her voice outside my door one afternoon, I froze. I thought I must have been imagining things, but no. There she was, standing beside my husband with a suitcase in hand, acting as though she had every right to waltz back into my home. I opened the door and stared at them, disbelief quickly turning to anger. I asked my husband what he thought he was doing. He calmly explained that he couldn't let his sister be without a place to stay, and that she'd promised not to cause any more issues. He added that since the baby was sleeping better, it wouldn't hurt to let her stay a little longer. I laughed, a short, sharp sound that caught them both off guard. I told him there was absolutely no way she was stepping back into this house. I reminded him that we'd agreed she was gone for good. My sister-in-law rolled her eyes and muttered something under her breath about me overreacting. That was the last straw. I told them both to stay right where they were and slammed the door in their faces. Immediately, I called my in-laws. I needed backup. When my father-in-law answered, I didn't hold back. I told him everything. How his daughter had suggested I move out of my own home with a newborn. How she'd made my life miserable, and how my husband had stood by and done nothing. He was quiet for a moment before asking if his son was with her. I said yes. They were both standing outside like lost strays. He said he was on his way. While I waited, my husband knocked on the door, begging me to let them in so they could explain. I shouted back that there was nothing left to explain and that he should hope his father arrived before I called mine. 15 minutes later, my in-laws pulled up. My mother-in-law looked furious, but my father-in-law was calm, too calm. He approached my husband and asked what on earth he'd been thinking. My husband tried to defend himself, saying he just wanted to help his sister and didn't think it would be a big deal. His father cut him off, saying this wasn't about his sister anymore. It was about the clear disrespect he'd shown me and our child. My sister-in-law started complaining, saying it wasn't fair and that she was the one who needed support. My father-in-law silenced her immediately, telling her she'd already done enough damage. Then he turned back to my husband and asked if he'd even considered how his actions had affected me, the woman who had just given birth to his child and should have been his top priority. Before my husband could answer, I called my own father. I didn't care if it made things worse. I needed someone on my side. He arrived within 20 minutes, visibly furious. The moment he got out of the car, he demanded to know what was going on. To his credit, my father-in-law didn't try to hide anything. He told my father everything, apologized for his son's behavior, and said he was ashamed of how things had turned out. My father, never one to sugarcoat, told my husband he didn't deserve to call himself a husband or a father. He said if my husband cared so much about his sister, then maybe he should move out with her and let me raise the baby in peace. He added that our family would gladly help me raise the child without him. My husband began pleading, saying he was sorry and only wanted to make things right. My father-in-law stopped him, saying he'd already done enough and it was time to face the consequences of his choices. Then my father and father-in-law went inside and began packing my husband's belongings. He followed them, begging them to stop, but they ignored him. My sister-in-law tried to intervene, but my mother-in-law pulled her back and told her to be quiet for once. Her confidence faded. She looked terrified and small. By the time they were done, all my husband's things were packed and piled on the front lawn. My father-in-law turned to him and said to take his sister and find somewhere else to stay. He said he would no longer enable their behavior, and if he'd known earlier, he would have kicked them both out himself. My husband dropped to his knees, pleading for forgiveness, promising he'd do anything to make things right. My father-in-law shook his head and said the time for that had passed. He'd made his decision and now had to live with it. My husband and his sister got into her old beat-up car, their belongings stacked in the back. My father stayed a while longer, holding the baby and reminding me that I'd done the right thing. He said I was stronger than I realized and didn't need anyone who couldn't value me. My father-in-law apologized again, wishing he'd stepped in sooner. I told him it wasn't his fault and that I appreciated his support now. Later, as I rocked my baby in the nursery, I whispered that everything would be okay, that we didn't need anyone who couldn't put us first. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never let anyone, not even my husband, make me feel this small again. The house is rented. We never signed a contract since it belongs to one of my father's close friends. A week later, 2 days after that confrontation, my husband showed up at the door. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair a mess, and he looked desperate. I cracked the door open just enough to block his view and asked what he wanted. He said he'd been staying at a friend's place, thinking about everything that had happened. He admitted he'd made mistakes and deeply regretted them. He said he didn't know why he let his sister manipulate him and that he should have stood by me instead. His voice broke as he begged for another chance, promising he'd never let anyone come between us again. I let his words linger for a moment, then told him that I'd made a decision too. I was filing for divorce. The shock on his face almost made me hesitate, but I didn't. I told him his behavior over the past few months had revealed who he truly was. I couldn't trust him to put our family first, and I couldn't spend my life waiting for him to let someone else disrespect me again. He looked crushed, saying he didn't want a divorce and that we could fix things if I just gave him a chance. I told him chances were for people who showed remorse before things reached this point. I reminded him how he had stood by while his sister treated me like a guest in my own home. While I was recovering from childbirth and caring for our newborn, I asked how he thought I could ever feel safe or valued after that. I admitted that I'd stayed quiet because I didn't want to escalate things, that I hadn't told either set of parents because I thought I could manage on my own. I now realized that was a mistake. Maybe if I'd spoken up sooner, it wouldn't have gone this far. I confessed that I'd been embarrassed to admit how bad things had gotten, especially after I'd invited his sister in out of kindness. I knew her relationship with her parents was strained. She'd run away at 16 and barely stayed in touch. I'd thought letting her stay with us might heal some of that tension, but it only made things worse. Our parents hadn't been visiting much since the baby was born because we'd agreed to limit guests during the first month for safety. Everyone respected that boundary, assuming we were fine. I told him I thought we'd been united in that decision, but clearly I was wrong. He brought up the delivery room, saying he'd been there when it mattered most. I reminded him that he'd fainted halfway through and needed more care than I did. I said I wasn't blaming him. Childbirth is intense, but he couldn't use that as a defense for everything else he'd done wrong. I told him I wasn't angry anymore, just done. I needed to focus on myself and the baby, which meant cutting out anyone or anything that caused unnecessary stress. He asked if there was anything he could do to change my mind, but I told him it was too late. Eventually, he left, still begging me to reconsider, but I stayed firm. I should have set boundaries earlier. I should have spoken up the first time his sister crossed a line. But hindsight is always 20/20.